Okay, hello Pippa, and thank you very much for agreeing to come and do this, talk really about how you recovered as a SIRPA-trained practitioner, and then to tell us about your insights from your own journey as well. And we've explained a little bit about you in the marketing for this, and we'll include it when it's edited. So I'm just really going to hand over to you, and it'd be wonderful to just have this on record so that new practitioners can also then come in and listen to it in their own time as well. Thanks for the call. Yeah,
excellent.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'll let you carry on, and then if there's any specific questions, I'll ask you on the way, and if not, then maybe we can have a bit of a discussion at the end.
Perfect. Excellent. And it won't play. Oh, there we go.
Time. There you are.
Excellent.
Time.
Hi, well, I'm Pippa, as Georgie said, and I'm a registered osteopath. I've been in practice for 25 years. 8 of those was actually working just with children at the Osteopathic Centre for Children in London. I'm a nearly trained SIRPA practitioner. I have 3% of the course remaining, so I'm nearly there. And I'm based in East Sussex. And my story is that I have or had a diagnosis of fibromyalgia until I discovered SIRPA. And I work hands-on at the gentler end of the osteopathic spectrum. And I've always been drawn to patients with trauma and children with anxiety. And I now combine that with the SIRPA approach.
Great.
So my chronic pain story really starts in the middle. For me, fatigue was the main sort of first persistent symptom that kind of made me start to think, you know, there's something not quite right here. So I was just, you know, suddenly one summer became incredibly tired and just couldn't shake it. And went to see the doctor, and they did all sorts of thyroid tests and things that of course came back with no result. So my pain didn't really come on until a bit later, and I'll explain why in a bit. But the pain I had was very typical of people with chronic pain. I had pain sort of everywhere, not all at the same time, not to the same amount. It varied in intensity and it varied in location. It's pretty much always been persistent in the low back, but it's literally been, you know, neck, migraines, jaw, particularly upper arms. You know, hanging the washing used to be like absolute torture. Wrists and hands, which of course is not great if you're working with them. Ribs, chest pain, abdominal pain, hips, knees, plantar fasciitis. You talk, you know, I've had it all. And each of the areas that you get pain initially when you don't know about it feels like a different condition. So it feels like you've got plantar fasciitis and costochondritis and TMJ disorder. So you feel like you've got this multitude of different things going on at the same time. And associated with that, again, which I didn't realize until later, were anxiety, skin condition like eczema, terrible insomnia, even though you're incredibly fatigued. Weight gain, which I know doesn't get talked about quite so much, but for me, almost overnight, I put on a lot of weight. And what was really frustrating with that, of course, is you're really tired, so you want to eat to keep your energy levels up. Your body has gone into that fight-flight response, and so it's like going, let's store every single morsel of anything that we can. And also because you've got the pain, you think, I can't exercise because I'm doing myself damage. So you're in this sort of perfect storm of, you know, that being a problem. Accompanied with that is, you know, irritable bowel and kind of reflux, which again, you think, oh, maybe I better go on a special diet. I better give up gluten. I better give up dairy. And actually, none of it tends to make a difference. What we suggest now to people is that they kind of keep off anything that's terribly processed and, you know, not too much of anything. But essentially, there was no one food stuff, because some days I could eat a sandwich and have absolutely no trouble at all. And the next day it would be a real problem. The other thing too is slightly irritable bladder, which again gets you up in the night, which doesn't help the insomnia. Terrible. I had terrible brain fog. You know, it's like I'd lost a huge amount of clarity in my thinking. My memory was really bad. So there's that all going on, but again, I hadn't at this point linked any of these bits together. Funny enough, my vision changed too. I ended up needing glasses for driving, and particularly at night. My night vision was much more poor. And strange ones like inability to control my temperature. So I'm a keen singer, and if I sing in a concert and I get a bit anxious before I'm going to sing in the concert, my temperature really, really raises. And there's everybody else in jumpers, and I'm sitting there thinking, I'm really hot. And the other one for me, which caused quite a lot of anxiety, was shortness of breath. You know, it was like I couldn't catch a breath. I couldn't get a good lungful of air. So those were just some of the things that, as I say, until I kind of came across the SIRPA approach, I'd never connected all of them together. So on my journey to getting my diagnosis, essentially I saw the doctor. When the pain kicked in, I went back to see the doctor, and they then did, they tested me for vitamin D, and my vitamin D levels at that point were so low they were indicative of sort of rickets. And so of course they went, okay, you've got a vitamin D deficiency, we'll give you vitamin D. And of course the levels go back up, they retest your blood and they go, well, you're fine. And you go, well, no, because I've still got all the symptoms. Yes. So essentially and then you wait a bit because you don't want to bother them and all of that sort of stuff. So I then did go back and I saw a different doctor, and I said, look, hang on a minute, my vitamin D may be good, I said, but I'm still not well, and I'm still in a lot of pain and all this sort of thing. So I then was referred for an MRI scan, which of course when that came back, it showed that I'd got degenerative disc disease all the way from my thoracic spine all the way down to my lumbar spine. And then it's like, well, you're stuck with that, that's, you're going to have to live with it, and don't run and don't do this and don't do that. And so you're sort of left thinking, oh great, I was in my sort of early 40s, this is sort of it. Luckily, in that time, I myself had done lots more investigation, and in my own self-diagnosis eventually got to a sort of a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, which seemed to fit all the boxes. And eventually, after the MRI, I did go back to the GP and say, look, I think it's fibromyalgia. And he said, well, we'll get you to see the rheumatologist. The rheumatologist agreed, and actually he was really good. I said to him, I said, I think I am, my plan is to get better. And he said, then you probably will. But essentially that, and he did sort of say, come back at any time, but they don't offer, there was nothing else offered at that point. There was no like, make sure you do this or make sure you do that. That was kind of, well, that's it, bye, come back if it gets worse. Yeah. And so you're then slightly left. So I wanted to talk a little bit today for those people who haven't experienced chronic pain themselves, as actually how it actually feels. Because we talk and we say we know that pain is real, but it really is real. and it feels like when you've done something else. So if in the past you have torn a muscle, it feels like that. Or if you've done a disc, I had a previous disc injury, and essentially it feels the same. And I think so it is very, very real. And I had suffered with the whole spectrum of pain, from a really dull ache, which I call my kind of like a shadow of pain. So it's like it's just there, you're not almost aware of it. I ended up in A&E one night thinking I've got pancreatitis. And you end up, I'd spoken to 111, and then I had to speak through the triage system to the doctors, and they said you need to get yourself to A&E. We're talking about 8.5, 9 on the pain scale, and you're like, and then the fear kicks in and you're really worried. So I went into hospital, they ran all the tests. Of course it wasn't. I got told it was fine, and actually over the next few days it did subside, because of course the anxiety and the fear and everything that went with it had made the pain worse. So it is a particular muscular pain, a lot of it, when talking about spinal pain. And one of them, the most dramatic it's ever felt to me is it almost felt like the muscle was being torn actually off the bone, if that makes sense. It felt like if I bent over any further, it was gonna come away. And that's a sort of quite a terrifying feeling. And then when you go and see somebody and they do imply that you're imagining it, then that's kind of really quite difficult. And in fact, actually, before I came to the SIRPA conference in I think it was 2017, I'd been to another conference that was run, and they talked about it in such a terrible way. I came away even more cross. They really, really didn't understand it. Right. So the other thing with the muscular pain is I think there's a generalized increase in tension in the body, and we find this in the patients we're treating as well as I found it in myself, that it's like somebody's eked up the tone in all the muscles, and so everything becomes stiff, everything becomes difficult. And in fact, this weekend I just did a course on TRE, trauma release exercises, really, really excellent course. And Dave Baselli, who started the TRE, he talks a lot about psoas, and it's really interesting that the tension that you get in the psoas muscle that is tight, and from an osteopathic perspective, that psoas muscle is sitting there just right underneath the diaphragm, which again is so important in any sort of stress related tension. The fatigue you feel with this is like, people talk about hitting the wall. I think this is more like, the wall's actually on top of you. I don't think you've hit it. I think it's fallen on you. And it's like a combination of really, really bad jet lag. I don't know, anybody who's had a baby, that sleeplessness that you get with a newborn, kind of along with sort of sleep torture, it really is, it is absolutely crushing, the fatigue. And I think often, or certainly for me, it came too with this sort of sense of nausea that often comes with fatigue. And so you just end up feeling really, really rotten a lot of the time. So not only are you in pain, you kind of feel a bit icky and exhausted. So I think for me, almost the fatigue is worse than the pain. That that's sort of, if I had to weigh them up, I think I prefer to have the pain than the fatigue. So the other thing that comes, or I certainly had, was the anxiety. And I think this was the symptom that I kind of almost added in last, if that makes sense. Or I'd had it all the time, but the one that kind of clicked in together last. And I'm like, oh, this is part of the same thing. I think probably I'd had anxiety since about the year 2000, and I'd had panic attacks, but hadn't really known what they were. And as I say, as everything comes together, you suddenly realize that the anxiety is so much part of the picture. And I think it's also, it contributes to that social isolation that I think comes often with these chronic pain conditions, because you haven't got the energy, you get triggered by other people, you're so tired that you almost end up being quite withdrawn and quite separate from people. And whilst actually getting together with people is brilliant, because they often bring you out of it and whatever, you just can't face it. And so you end up, I think, with this almost, it's not a kind of clinical depression, it's like an isolation depression almost, that where you can't drag yourself out because you can't sort of bear it, really. And the word that just covers the whole thing is just overwhelmed. I think, that's actually what's occurring in your system, and the whole world feels overwhelming, and I mean, stupid things like, small blue LED lights on the edge of a telly or something. If you sleep in a room with one of those, you can't sleep. If there's any noise sort of at all, you can't sleep. A car backfires and you think you've been shot. It's that real sort of sense of rabbit in the headlights. So what always interests me is, I think actually I am the perfect chronic pain candidate when you look back at my history, because I am really trying to give up perfectionism. I'm really trying. I'm better than I used to be, but it's definitely I've definitely got that in my makeup. I'm quite a people pleaser, so I tick another box, and I always love it when patients come in and we talk about this, and I go, it's okay, I am too.
Yes, I do.
I am absolutely fascinated and have done quite a lot of reading about adverse childhood experiences. Absolutely so enjoyed Donna's talk at the last conference. And her new book's about to arrive.
It's great.
And I don't think I've got a particularly high ACE score myself. but what I do find, what I think is linked, is I'm adopted. And what's really interesting with adoption is I was adopted quite young. I've lived in the most lovely family. I've never really wanted for anything. However, what people don't often talk about is the bit before you were adopted. It gets a little bit forgotten, and I think it's getting better in the, as the research comes on in the last few years, and people are much more aware. But there, for a very, very long time, it was almost like, oh, but it's, life's been lovely. Don't, you know, don't, you know, or don't, you know, not don't make a fuss. People aren't sort of saying that, but I think it's like, you know, oh, but it was all, you know, that was all finished by the time you were 2 months old. But what we have to consider within that is the you know, think about what David Hanscom was saying the other day about the fact that your, you know, the body you live in is full of all these neurochemicals that essentially are, you know, how we feel. And if I know that my birth mother had a very stressful pregnancy, and I know that she knew she needed to give me up for quite a lot of that, and her stress within her system, and therefore the stress that would have been in my system would have probably been huge. And of course, now people are more aware of that, and we talk about it, and we're aware of it. But I think actually that I only sort of really became aware of that in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and the importance of that.
And the attachment side of them being taken away from your mother. I mean, that's huge, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think I had, you know, 2 or 3, I think it was 2 sets of foster parents before I was adopted, and I was adopted at 2 months.
Wow.
So essentially,
yes.
I don't know for how long I was with my birth mother, but I was with her for a little bit, then a foster carer, then another foster carer, and then I was adopted at 2 months. Yeah. And you're like, you know, and I think in that, you know, in the early 70s, that was sort of not considered, you know.
No.
I think it probably is more now. So but yeah, it's a huge sort of part of the picture. And I think what it does too with regards to sort of the people pleasing, in my little head, and nobody ever told me this, but in my head somewhere along the line I went, if I'm naughty, I'll get sent back. And so you try and please everybody, and you try and be a very good girl, and you know, so that actually, and then that just carries on, you know, through your life, really.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really important. In fact, it's an area I want to do a little bit more research into. So move forward a few years, and I end up into, you know, a somewhat toxic marriage, and that I tried to stay in because I'm a people pleaser, and I stayed in it for quite a number of years, and eventually knew that I had to leave for the sort of my own well-being and that of my son. And so that was many years of, again, being on the edge and not breathing, and, you know, being worried about what was going to happen next. And so that, I think probably it was in that period that actually really my symptoms started, but it wasn't until now, looking back, you go, oh, do you know, I had quite a lot of pain then, but it perhaps wasn't persistent, or that's certainly within that period that the anxiety and panic attacks kind of started. So that's definitely, you know, important. And obviously within that period, I lost a child halfway through pregnancy, which again, in hindsight, now I know, and I've done lots of journaling and things, is really important. So the thing about that was I've had some excellent counselling, absolutely fantastic counsellor, and I got really good at telling my story. Really good at telling my story, to the point that I could tell all the traumatic things that happened with no emotion at all. And it wasn't really until later, going back through the timeline with the full SIRPA case history questionnaire, and then looking at the journaling, that I realised actually how significant some of that still was. For instance, I think I had my first panic attack in about 2000, but it was only a couple of years ago when I went back and go, why is it I get these panic attacks? Why is it I can't get to sleep at night? What is it that I'm frightened of? Why do I get in this state? And I realized that I dealt with a huge amount of stuff with regards to the loss, But what I hadn't done is, until I journaled and told that story again and got to sort of the next level, I'd feared for my own life in that moment. I thought I wasn't going to survive. And since then, having recognized that, I think I've had one panic attack. That's it. You know, it was like, it was finding, and that's the beauty of the journaling. It's that linear, rather than the story just going round and round and round, you get to the next bit and you go, oh, it's like the light bulb, you know, the light comes on and you're like, oh, that's why.
Well done. Yes.
Needless to say, I then got myself out of the toxic relationship, which it was good, but a stress within itself.
Yeah, well done.
And then I, in about, I think it was 2013, my son was really struggling at school, and he decided he wasn't going to school, and I did actually fully support his decision. But he was 12 at the time, and he then became home educated. And much as I denied it for about 3 or 4 years, that might have just been when the fatigue started. So for me, the big thing about that was kind of fighting back the social norms, you know, and kind of going, no, he's going to be fine. Yeah, of course he'll do maths and English. Yes, of course he's got friends, which of course he was all going to do. But it was that was the point at which I think that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back with regards to that was when the fatigue literally kind of kicked in about 2 months later. And again, it was only when doing that sort of the SIRPA questionnaire that you later on that you go, oh, that's the, you know, oh yeah, okay, I get that now, and it all links it up together. And that's what we find with patients is so beautiful when they, as I say, they twig and the pieces all start to join together. After the home education, we ended up having to move house 3 times in 3 years, and that was when the pain kicked in. It was the stress of losing our home twice in a very short succession, when we were renting, and the landlords said, you've got to move on. You know, nothing we'd done, it was just that circumstances and whatever, but essentially almost caused a level of sort of PTSD or post-traumatic stress, you know, when you lose your home, that, you know, with through no fault of your own. And that, as I say, that's really when the pain kicked in. And also that's when I stopped sleeping. In fact, I think probably it kicked in after a month of no sleep, having been told we'd have to move out. And so it really, now again, looking back, you can see the real link between the stressful event and the symptoms. And then, of course, the ongoing stress is being self-employed.
Yes.
As many of us practitioners know.
Yeah.
So that's the ongoing thing, I think, that keeps the symptoms just, you know, a little bit there some of the time. So it was a very exciting time for me in 2017 when I came to the conference, mostly for my sort of interest from a professional point of view. And I sat in that room at the Royal Society of Medicine, and there was a whole group of people who got it. And they understood, and they had the evidence to back it up, and there was nobody was being condescending, and you believed that they believed you. And it was really amazing, as well as, you know, learning about and subsequently reading sort of everybody's books. It was amazing. And that was, like a lot of people when they read the books, you say they often have a pain-free day. I came back from conference, and the next day was probably one of the 4 days that year I had no pain. And so I then went on and read, particularly the first book I read, I think, was the Sarno's The Mind Body Prescription, and then your book, Georgie, around chronic pain, Your Key to Recovery. And again, it started to all make sense, but actually I couldn't do it on my own. So I actually saw Simon, who is a SIRPA practitioner in East Sussex as well, and that was a real sort of turning point in my pain recovery. And I suppose the important thing that I probably learned from conference was to not be afraid of the pain. That was like huge. That was like, oh, okay, so actually I can exercise and I can move, and I'm not going to do myself any damage. And that was absolutely crucial in knowing, you know, that I you know, in starting me on my recovery. The other things too that I think personally for me were really, really important was learning self-compassion. And I can remember Simon looking at my case history and going down it and said, well, you know, you've had a lot go on, you know, you've had this and you've had that and whatever. And he just sort of said, you're well done for surviving,
Yeah.
you're still here.
Yeah.
And in that
Good
moment you go, oh, actually,
Yeah.
right. Oh, you know, I yes. And it was amazing. And at that point you suddenly sit back and go, actually, I have survived all this trauma. And a technique we sometimes use in practice now is that just telling somebody back parts of their story and just asking how that makes them feel if it had been me. And they go, oh, actually, yeah, that was quite hard, wasn't it? I said, yeah, and you've done that.
Yeah.
And you've survived. And I find that hugely, hugely helpful.
Absolutely.
And building the process then allowed me to build on that self-compassion and to learn just to be enough, not to be striving for good enough the whole time, you know. And I probably now in the day achieve a third of what I was achieving before I started this process. But actually that's because I was trying to achieve 2/3 more than I should have been trying to achieve. So I really have, you know, kind of cut back and I'm doing, you know, I do enough, but I don't try and do more than enough.
Yes.
And the other really important thing, as I say, is I'd had some really good counselling, but I think the counselling, as I say, had almost allowed me to shut away from my feelings. And by going through this process, and particularly again with the journaling, it's a safe way to go back and feel the feelings, and then I understand them. And I think you said at some point in the training, Georgie, about it's about sort of 90 seconds as it passes, the emotion passes back through. And
so some of the evidence shows, yes.
Yeah, and it's not as bad as you think it's going to be, but you do actually need to allow yourself the time and the space to go into it, go back through it. And the journaling has been hugely, hugely helpful.
Right.
So in practice now, in our osteopathic practice, we I've, as I say, nearly completed the training. And I hope at some point that my 2 osteopathic associates will do the training too. But in the meantime, we've all become much more chronic pain aware. And one of and everybody now in the practice being aware means that they will send the patients that I need to see to me. And we've sort of changed the way we take our case histories.
Right.
We don't take a full case history at the first one, but we've changed some of the questions to make sure that we're filtering people into the right directions, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And again, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but the SIRPA questionnaire as a practitioner is so helpful because I think it helps the patient sort their story. So they, you know, they start to align, as I say, the symptoms with the events rather than actions. And for us, it also helps us kind of go, oh, okay, we need to sort of, we can see how this all happened chronologically, which is really, really important, and what made it better and what made it worse. I particularly use the emotional awareness exercise with clients, but interesting enough, I do it hands-on. So I work at the really gentle end of the osteopathic spectrum, and a lot of the techniques are almost just like listening with your hands. And what's really fascinating doing the emotional awareness exercise with patients is that I would say in the past, I always had an idea of different emotions feeling slightly different in the body. So for instance, anger feels different to fear slightly. It's almost, and you know, tiredness feels different to I suppose real fatigue and that sort of thing. And what's interesting when you do this with your hands on is often the patient is telling you what they think you want to hear, and actually the body is saying something different. And so it's almost like the body's not letting go. And when you get to the real kind of core emotion of this, and people, they don't want to, oh, I'm frustrated, but they don't want to talk about fear or real sadness. But when they do, the body just melts like butter. It's really fascinating to do the two things together. And you can really feel those tissues letting go as they identify either the event or the emotion that has been important to them.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and so the other thing too that I know you were on the course, Georgie, when we with Lorimer, I find for a descriptive thing, I find his neurotags quite, you know, the neural pathways and how he talks about, you know, that's created in an event, and then actually when you have a pain, you know, so many years later, it can refire that pathway. So
Yes.
I find that as a descriptive thing really, really helpful for patients. And also DIMS and SIMS, the danger in me and the safety in me, is quite another good way of actually saying to people, so what's, you know, what's stressing your system, what's making your body feel like, you know, there's danger, and what can you do to change that. And on the screen here we've got our one of our visual things we use in the practice now is, you know, what's in your chronic pain illness backpack. And when you put it out like that and people look at it, they often go, oh yes, oh, and I've got a bit of that and a bit of that.
That's great.
Yeah, no, we really like it. And then what we talk about is, you know, I say to people, can you imagine if every time you've had an event in your life, or something's upset you or triggered you or been, you know, very upsetting, you pop that on, almost even just on a piece of paper, and put it in your backpack. Can you imagine by now how full your backpack is and how heavy your backpack is getting? It's no wonder you've got back pain. And then the beauty of that is what we then says, you know, what we could do is we could take a couple of those things out and just address them, maybe by journaling, and actually then you won't have to put them back in your backpack.
Yes, fantastic.
And I do find with journaling that some patients will really take to it like a duck to water, and some patients just are a little bit reticent.
Yeah.
And that's fine. So sometimes we will recommend sort of EFT, emotional freedom technique, the tapping, to kind of get them going to telling their story. But quite often, or if we can get them to journal, the one thing that I know you talk about on the course very much is the unsent letter. There is it's such a brilliant resource, the unsent letter.
Yeah.
Because we can we often recommend to people that they pick not necessarily the most important person in their situation, but even somebody a little bit on the outside of that, who actually they can send an unsent letter to without feeling too guilty, or write an unsent letter to somebody who they feel not too guilty about. And that actually then gets them started in that journaling process.
Yes. And then sometimes even if somebody doesn't really can't get into the journaling, sometimes I'll use the chair technique. And they can imagine that person sitting in that chair, and then they're telling them and shouting at them and even hitting the chair if necessary, to really express how they like, giving them an unsent discussion or whatever, telling what they feel, to feel the emotions, and then even sit in the chair afterwards, or sit in their chair and actually let them reply, so you begin to see it from that person's point of view. So sometimes I do that if somebody really struggles with the journaling, which is
and some people really do, and some people I do find will don't ever get to it, but essentially it's you know, if they can, it's just such a wonderful thing. Absolutely. So what we've also discovered as we go on is all this information, all the about the neural pathways, about being the trauma, it doesn't actually just apply to the chronic pain patients. We had I had a lady in last week, and she had hip pain, and it had come on quite suddenly. She was in her 70s. It had come on quite suddenly in September last year, and she'd been to the doctor. She'd had a sort of an X-ray and an MRI, and they've said, well, you're going to have a hip replacement. And so we'd taken her history, and I said, well, was there anything else going on? Because I said, normally with a sort of an arthritic hip like that, it doesn't come on immediately. It doesn't come on, you know, just overnight. It's sort of more grumbling. And she'd certainly had pain before, but this had come on quite suddenly. And so I kept saying, no, you sure there was nothing stressful that happened last year? Nothing, you know, didn't have to move house, no. Anyway, got her, she was lying down, we were doing the movements through her hip, and she was really quite sore, and her hip was very, very tight. And, you know, a lot of pain and very small range of movement that was pain-free. Anyway, she then suddenly, about, I don't know, 15 minutes in, went, oh, actually, do you know, my daughter was in hospital last year from March till September. She nearly died. And it was like, oh, so you were quite stressed about that then? And she went, yeah. And essentially, of course, her daughter had come out of hospital in September, and her pain had come on pretty soon afterwards.
Yeah.
Anyway, I haven't seen her again, so I can't tell you whether it's been a miracle or not. But she was so funny. She walked out of the corridor at the end of her appointment. She just turned around and winked at me and went, "That feels quite a lot better." and you sit and think, yeah, I think maybe it's because, you know, it's not just about the wear and tear.
Yes, quite.
So, as I say, we're finding it in a lot of our patients. Yes. One of the most dramatic ones we had in practice actually was a lady who'd had pain, I think, for 2 years. And she'd been seeing my colleague, and my colleague said to me, Pippa, she said, "I'm not quite getting there with this. Could you have a look?" And so I said, I did. And I said, "I'm just going to ask you some more questions other than the ones that Louise has asked you, if that's okay." And she was fine with that. And I just said, "Did anything happened when your pain came on? Again, anything stressful at the time?" And she thought for a minute. She went, "Actually," she said, "and it is quite shocking." She said, "I was out walking one day and I found a man hanging in a tree." Oh. And essentially, in that moment, her body had gone into that freeze response, and she'd not come out of it for sort of 2 years. And she'd had she'd had some really good counselling, but when we put the two things together for her, she came back for one more appointment, the pain was gone. We didn't see her again until another incident of something else, months and months later. And
sent a chill through me.
Say again?
That sent a chill through me.
Yeah, no, it was really amazing. And it's and as I say, now we're just on the lookout for it, all the time. And as I say, not even in our patients that have got persistent pain. And one of my things that I'm really just really working with patients and actually a little bit into the profession as well is just that education, because I think generally across the board in musculoskeletal medicine, the message isn't quite getting there yet. It's coming, but it's not. It's you still see people going, not considering the stress. And I think that that to me, I'm absolutely passionate now about trying to spread the word about that really, and have done again with trying to be quite trauma aware within the practice as well, because I think that's so important.
It's wonderful.
So the other thing we do in the practice that we find quite useful is we have a recovery toolkit. And this is a set of resources that are on the website for people to use in their recovery. It partly saves us time, because rather than having to send specific meditations or specific journaling articles or whatever to people, we have it all as one resource in one place, which we're finding really helpful. And sometimes some more practical things too, like some Tai Chi and some breathing exercises and some thoracic exercises and things like that, because sometimes people find the more emotional stuff harder to get to. So actually, if you give them something physically relaxing to do first, it eases them into the process of the more emotional stuff. So, and that that's sort of where I'm at. And this is, I had to put in my favourites, my absolute favourite quote.
I like that.
Which people like. So any questions?
Wow, Pippa, that's wonderful. I think you covered it all anyway, but really interesting. And I suppose the main question for me now, probably for everybody here, is how are you now?
Well, I would say I'm 95 to 98% of the way there most of the time. Yeah. Interesting enough, just before Christmas, I had the norovirus. I was really, just the bug quite badly, and I was on my own in the house, and I was kind of nearly passed out on the floor, and I was, I got in a real panic, and it was quite stressful. And actually, for 2 days afterwards, I had such terrible pain, terrible pain.
There.
But the beauty of it is I'm not frightened of it anymore. Right. So you kind of go, oh God, this is really annoying. But actually, I know now that maybe not instantly, but over the next few days, I've got all the tools in my toolkit now. I've got all the strategies to kind of just work through that and come out the other side.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, because you hear lots of patients saying, well, I think I'm 95% better or whatever. So is 95% the fact that people will sometimes have episodes like that? Or, if that's 95%, I think that's life. The mind-body relationship, and that if we're going to be feeling vulnerable, if we are, our immune system's low or we're feeling stressed, then it's not surprising that old neural pathways will be triggered. But like you say, it's not having that fear of it, and we know then that we can then use what we know to actually get ourselves back quicker than we would have done before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's lovely is you get to the point where you actually start listening to your body, which is, I think, what you spend years not doing.
Absolutely.
So you kind of go, oh, okay. I mean, I actually, I can't remember what it was. It might have been 2017. I took a 6-week sabbatical thinking, right, okay, if I take 6 weeks off, this was before I knew all about this, I'll get myself better. I'll rest and I'll do and I rested, and I did have a nice time over that 6 weeks, and I felt very, I did feel better. I went back to work. I went back in hell for leather. I went back at the same speed as I'd come out at. Yes. And within about a week and a half, I was floored again.
Yes.
And yeah, okay, I'm gonna have to do something slightly differently here.
Yes.
And it's now allowing yourself to rest. I mean, I would say now I still sleep maybe 2-3 days a week. I might have just a short nap, particularly on a Tuesday. I work afternoon and into the evening. And so actually on a Tuesday morning, I'll have lunch and I'll have a 20-minute lie down just to make sure that I'm ready for the afternoon. And it's not about, oh, I'm being lazy or anything. It's just about that self-care. And and also just saying, I've got much better at saying no. Still not very good at it, but I've got better at it. And it's like going, actually, I'm really sorry, I can't do that right now. And it is about, life's about juggling. We've all got busy things going on, and trying to even do the things that you enjoy as well. They become a bit of but it's that actually, what's important, and balancing, actually, I need to do something for me with actually, I need to work or I need to do nothing. So.
Absolutely. And as you said earlier on, you say to your patients, well, I am a perfectionist, overly conscientious, etc. And I think it's important that they know that we can relate to that as well. And I would say that as well. And I'll just say that I am so much better now at actually recognizing when I'm causing myself stress.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not that we change our personality, that's innately us. But it's just and then it's recognizing, having more of an emotional awareness and recognizing what's going on in our body before we actually end up with symptoms, preferably. But none of us are perfect, and often the shit hits the fan, and okay, things happen. But it is lit as long as we accept that it's just the mind-body relationship. And it's just, I read it recently, I think last week somewhere, if you don't stop your body, the body will stop you.
Yes.
And I just love that. And I just think, yeah, that's exactly what's going on, isn't it?
Yeah, there's another quote that's similar to that I can't remember exactly, about yes, if you don't listen when your body speaks to you quietly, then you have
when it's whispering.
Yes, until it's
roaring. You don't listen when it's whispering, then it'll shout at you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, this has been wonderful, Pippa. Thank you so much.
That's all right. Well, I hope people find it useful.
I'm sure they will. And I think it's really important for all of us that we understand this. And I do feel that when we have experienced it experientially, then it actually helps us in our work. And I would doubt very much that actually there are any practitioners who haven't had any TMS symptoms. Therefore, but this and hearing your story and just how bad you were, and for you to have gone through the journey you have and been so effective with the work you've done on yourself is very inspiring. So
I think for me, the other thing too was I've always worked of course evidence-based, but quite intuitively too. And I think what was really interesting is actually what I felt was intuitive is now in the literature is all there. And
Absolutely.
I think, I don't know, it's like after, because as I say, it's after like 20 odd years of being in practice that suddenly it's like all the pieces fell into place. And it's like it's joined everything together. And that just is amazing.
I think that's exactly how I felt when I came across this, definitely. Well, thank you very much. And I know everybody will find this really helpful.
Brilliant.